So our next panel is called Defining and Training Journalists in the Digital Age. And this panel is looking at examining revisions to how we understand and learn about journalism. So there's 4 panelists. Each will get about 15 minutes. And just like the last panel, we're going to hold questions till the end. So our first, and I'll introduce the panelists as they come up. Our first panelist is Ellen Goodman, who is a professor at Rutgers University School of Law. She's the co-director and co-founder of Rutgers Institute for Information Policy and Law. She helped to, and I learned this when I was doing her bio. I was excited to find this out. She helped to produce a report on the information needs of communities as a distinguished visiting fellow scholar at the FCC, which is a report we will refer to all the time. So her presentation is on, which I'll bring up. The networked fourth estate in the law. Is that?
That's what it is.
That's the title. So
Different from what's in the agenda.
Different than what's in the agenda. So I was a little like, ah.
Okay.
But so here's Ellen Goodman. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I'm glad you refer to that report, because I don't think anyone in Washington does. Okay. So, Phil, thank you so much for inviting me. I really, I love being in this environment. I learned so much from media and journalism scholars. I feel a little pressure being the lawyer here that I'm supposed to come up and give you the definition of journalism that courts are using. And sadly, I can't do that because they are in the soup as well. So yes, the title of this talk is The Networked Fourth Estate, which a title I take from Yochai Benkler, which I'll talk about a little bit, and the law. And I was thinking, what might you be expecting? And I could, of course, when I say "and the law," I could be talking about regulatory dimensions. We could talk about net neutrality and media ownership and mergers and spectrum policy. And all of these will be affected by conceptions of journalism, conceptions of algorithms as editors. So that would be a fruitful area to discuss. But instead, I'm going to focus on the courts and how they are seem to be thinking about journalism and journalists, which I guess was the title in your agenda. So the bottom line is that they have no definition. There are evolving conceptions of who is a journalist and what is journalism. And in some ways, it doesn't matter that much because, at least in terms of hard power, that is, when the law comes down like a hammer or lifts up with a privilege, there aren't that many areas where journalists are treated differently from other individuals. But in other ways, it actually matters a lot because of the soft power that journalists have had. And by that, I mean just areas in which the government has exercised self-restraint, also corporations, and extended courtesies to those they think are doing journalism. So this debate in my area really, of course, in your area, in journalism studies, the question of what is journalism has been perennial. I think in my area in law, it's also been an issue always, but it really intensified in the WikiLeaks period. And so you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the 2013 debate between Bill Keller and Glenn Greenwald. Keller was arguing for a more limited and exclusive definition of journalism, whereas Greenwald was arguing for an expansive definition. And this kind of debate between what I'm going to call the inclusionists or the exclusionists, like Keller was then in his old job, and the inclusionists has sort of persisted. We can see it playing out in the law. And in general, I think it's fair to say that courts and legislatures, largely at the state level, in the U.S., are moving rather swiftly towards a functional definition of the news media. It's a little, we know it when we see it, although perhaps a little more defined than that. If you're doing something that looks like journalism, you're a journalist for the purposes of the relatively few privileges that journalists enjoy. However, I think that we may be seeing a counter trend, and it's coming in the form of privacy laws. So, increasingly, and every day it seems that there's another one, legislatures and courts are being called on to provide more privacy protections for data gathering and dissemination. So examples are in revenge porn, mugshots, the right to be forgotten in Europe. I'll try to touch on these. Drone privacy laws. Whenever a court wants to extend privacy protections, there's then a push to exclude the news media, right? They should be not included in whatever general privacy protections are being granted. So then there's a push to actually define journalism, and sometimes there's a push to define it rather narrowly. Otherwise, these privacy protections don't have much meaning. Okay, so this Tao Center report, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, I think is representative of what's coming out of the field and largely representative of what I heard, some of what I heard this morning. News isn't a coherent category. And yet, we have hard power, the force of law, and soft power that have long either adopted definitions or are built on conceptions of the news. So this is a problem. Something has to be done about the mismatch between the news that exists in statutes and in the heads of decision makers and the fact that there's no agreement on what news is. And so, on the one hand, we have press advocacy organizations who argue against any definition of journalism because they worry that, and this you saw this very pointedly in the federal shield law debates over the last 5 years. The concern is that definitions by their nature are exclusive, and so advocates want the most inclusive definition and then preferably no definition. But at the same time, there's concern that a boundless conception of the Fourth Estate will fail to confer any kind of prestige and therefore privilege on the press. And so no definition may lead to reduced rights. So I think, and you can see this tension between the inclusionists and the exclusionists, I think, in Yochai Benkler's work and his advocacy on behalf of Chelsea Manning in the WikiLeaks prosecution. So he has tried to arrive at a functional definition of the Fourth Estate. This is, by the way, from the Berkman Center, and they now have a bunch of these mappings of discourse on various topics. This was the SOPA-PIPA debate of 2011-2012. This was done in 2013. And so, so you can see this sort of vast array of entities that arguably are part of the networked Fourth Estate that set this agenda and developed the discourse around this issue. So he has tried to define this networked Fourth Estate as something less than everyone who distributes information in the public interest. And he's focused on a set of what he calls encoded practices around verification, restraint, intent to inform. So basically your standard list of good journalistic practice. So it's a very broad definition, but not a boundless definition. What I think is interesting is that you start to see the fissures between his very broad definition and what he actually testified to in the WikiLeaks trial. So his very broad definition goes something like this. It's networked individuals and cooperative associations speaking their minds and organizing around their causes. When it came to the pressing question at the time, whether WikiLeaks counted as the press, we see a resort back to a narrower definition. So there, he emphasized that WikiLeaks, after all, was exercising responsible and journalistic behavior. In his testimony for the defense in the Chelsea Manning military trial, he argued that Manning should be understood to have leaked documents to an entity performing journalism. He distinguished between the social movement functions of WikiLeaks, which he said were not part of the Fourth Estate, and its journalistic functions. And so, this was one of the rare cases in which actually the definition of journalism mattered, because if WikiLeaks were determined to be an enemy as opposed to a journalistic entity, then you have Espionage Act liability for Manning. Some of the activities around WikiLeaks, however, we can see soft power coming into play. So, as you probably know, the government pressured banks and financial institutions to withdraw their services from WikiLeaks. There's nothing in the law that would prevent the state from doing that to the New York Times or to doing it to any online provider. There's something in norms that would prevent the government from doing that to the New York Times. And so, the fact was the government was not treating WikiLeaks as a journalistic entity. So it was treating it outside whatever fourth estate it was going to extend this norm of self-restraint to. And I think in some ways this soft power, as I suggested, is really the thing to focus on, although I'm going to get to some hard power issues as well. And this is just because of the way the press clause has been interpreted. So Justice Stewart, making his second appearance this morning, he was an advocate of reading the press clause with teeth, that the press clause actually has meaning, and that the news media, journalistic enterprises, of course, he was thinking about 20th century forms of the institution, should be given heightened privilege over individuals. But his view has really not been borne out in the law. And in fact, many people think that the press clause is really a constitutional redundancy. It doesn't do anything more than the speech clause of the First Amendment. And I think you see this very clearly in the Citizens United case. Of course, this is not principally what it's known for, but in fact, the whole structure of Citizens United is premised on this. If, after all, the press can spend freely on elections, then so should all corporations, because there's no difference between the press and any other corporation. And so generally what we see in the law is that press, by and large, are treated the same as individuals. They have no special rights of access to courts. And I think sometimes this takes journalists by surprise. No special rights of access to government records, and no special rights in the tort area either. So when we think about the Rolling Stone article and whether that was an act of journalism or something else, it's really not going to matter very much for any defamation action that will be brought against it. On the other hand, sometimes that's not true. So there are situations where the press has special privileges, shield laws probably being the most significant ones, and so that's really where we see a lot of activity. How are news media going to be defined for the shield laws? There's the soft power, federal self-restraint on issuing subpoenas. Of course, there is no federal shield law, so we really do rely on federal self-restraint, and the Department of Justice has a definition of what it considers to be news media, and the definition is quite functional. Right? It's not limited to legacy media. So the definitions that we're seeing coming out, especially of the states, are broad and rather functional. So as I said, defamation really doesn't distinguish between individuals and the press in terms of the kind of deference that you will get when it's a public figure or a matter of public concern. Shield laws, and I'll touch on New Jersey's in a second, are clearly moving to functional definitions, to acts of journalism. I just note that this is on the right is the proposed federal shield law that never has not yet been passed, and there, interestingly, there was a very conscious effort to exclude WikiLeaks from the definition of an entity that would be covered. So in any kind of entity that's just serving as a sort of data dump platform, it was not going to be protected. I don't have time really to talk about the European context, although it is in many ways a much more interesting and robust area where these conversations are happening because there's just more media law there. And so But there, too, there's a movement towards a functional definition of the journalistic enterprise. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little about the New Jersey Shield Law, and Charlie, I'm going to call on you in a second since you've had actual experience with it. So New Jersey happens to have an exceptionally robust Shield Law, more robust than most states because it covers not just the source but also the materials that journalists use. In 2011, there was the case Too Much Media versus Hale, which actually found that there was no privilege in the case of this message board that a woman was posting on. However, it adopted this test, which is very broad. So connection to news media defined very broadly to include sort of anything that's analogous to legacy media, but clearly includes blogs. For the purpose of gathering or disseminating news, and when you are the information that's sought in the subpoena has been gathered through professional news gathering activities. That's what the New Jersey standard is. So, Charlie, do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience with a subpoena and the New Jersey Shield Law?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm the editor of New Brunswick Today, for those of you who don't know. We have been covering a lot of interesting things here in the city, and one of those things ended up resulting in myself filing an ethics complaint against someone, and it was a hearing, and the ethics board didn't follow its own rules, didn't properly record the hearing, so they subpoenaed the newspaper to try to get our videos of it. It was an extraordinary overstep on their part, and thankfully there were attorneys at Jerome and Montclair, who were able to represent the newspaper and stand up to this illegal subpoena. And what came out of it was coverage in other media outlets. Star Ledger covered it, and it was really surprising to learn that the attorney for the ethics board didn't even really understand the Shield Law in the first place. He thought it only applied to compelling somebody to reveal a source, but in actuality, it as the professor said, is quite broad and covers all news gathering activities, and certainly our videotapes of a public meeting would fall under that protection as well. So it was very interesting. It's also been covered by a media law journal as well. So it was a fun experience.
All right, thank you. Well, I think, Charlie, I don't know if you would identify yourself as an activist as well as a journalist. That is how you are characterized in the reports. And I think this coalescence of sort of citizen journalist, activist, journalist is presenting a real challenge to the understanding of what the Shield Law does. And so another New Jersey case, Tina Renna, this was in Union County. So she's a blogger. She runs the website The County Watchers. She had the prosecutor sought the names of 16 local government officials that she had accused of misusing county generators after Hurricane Sandy, and so she resisted the subpoena. Superior Court judge held that the Shield Law did apply to her, even though she's an activist / journalist, and this blog counted as news media. What I think is interesting about her case is that even though we have this standard, and the court, this was the New Jersey Supreme Court, said it sort of reprimanded the lower court for having looked at journalistic practice. Were you holding yourself out as a journalist? Did you promise confidentiality to your source? The Supreme Court said no, courts shouldn't look at that. Nothing in the standard requires any inquiry into that. And yet, in this lower court decision, which did uphold the Shield, what did they look at? They looked at the fact that her method of talking to sources her attendance at meetings, her use of Open Public Records Act requests, and they said it's sufficiently similar to the methods used by traditional news media entities to qualify. So, and this again, I view that as soft power having entered into a hard power context, because the court, and I think this is unavoidable, and really the key takeaway point is that courts will inevitably, and I think we'll see this in Rolling Stone too, so even though doctrinally it doesn't matter whether Rolling Stone was doing good journalism or not, I think inevitably judges, lawmakers, policymakers will consider, based on something, based on your research and your recommendations, what good journalism is, and it will enter into the definitions and the treatment. Okay, I will wrap up. If you have questions about these kinds of new emerging areas, I'm happy to talk about that in questions. And in particular, I'd love to tell you the story about my visit to Google in London and how they're dealing with the right to be forgotten. Because, Phil, there they are forced to be editors, and they will acknowledge that they are forced to be editors in terms of passing on 1 million requests to have information delisted. And it's remarkable how similar they are, and it's dawning on them how similar they are to editors in terms of remaking the decisions that many editors have already made when they posted the material in the first place. So that's something to be focused on. The last thing I want to say, just to zoom out a little bit, largely what I've talked about are sort of instrumental reasons to be for an inclusive definition or for a more exclusive definition. I think there are also some differences, some tensions in terms of First Amendment values. And so I really like the work of Dean Robert Post, and he has sort of conceptualized First Amendment values in 2 ways. So one is that what we're really concerned about is democratic legitimation. We want everyone to say what they need to say, and that's a reason for an expansive definition of journalism, so that everyone who has something to say gets whatever protections there are in hard power or soft power. They can draw on the prestige of the press. And so it's focused less on journalistic output than on journalistic input, and so you can call that, that aligns itself with pluralism and diversity and those kinds of concepts. But then there is another value, which is democratic competence. And so that is really the value that everything that needs to be known gets to be known. And this is much more of a focus on high-quality journalism. And I think it tends to lead to a more restrictive definition, because if you are in the position of asking for subsidies or asking for institutional change or asking for legal privilege, you necessarily have to have a more circumscribed set of recipients of those privileges and largesse. And the reason you're asking for them is because you think certain kinds of expression needs to be supported so that there can be democratic competence. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Next, we have Jerome Almonte, if you want to go ahead and come on up. He's the Distinguished Professor Emeritus in the School of Communication and Information. He was the founding chairman of the Department of Journalism and Media Studies and the founding director of the Journalism Resources Institute. He's also a former journalist, and he serves as a media consultant in journalism and mass communications training, as well as in university curriculum development. And his presentation will be on the urgent need for journalists to have lifelong learning and continuing education in the digital age.
Okay. Thanks. I wanted to thank a few people first. Jack, for your history lesson this morning. Now I know how it feels. And also I want to thank George White, who is here, from Executive Director of the New Jersey Press Association. George, would you? Good. I'm not going to read my paper, and I'm not going to show any slides. I have a hand puppet if anybody needs it. But I'm a dismal failure when it comes to my PowerPoint sort of melting away. But I was thinking of the experience of trying to create a Department of Journalism and Media Studies, at that point urban communications, after we had deactivated the School of Journalism and replaced it with a Department of Human Communication. The publishers went nuts when they heard this and basically asked if we could restore journalism to the university. My experience in doing that reminds me of a New Yorker cartoon of a fish coming out of the ocean and walking up the sand to start growing feet and to become something else. And it was so hot in the sand that he ran back down into the water. And there were many times when I felt that way too, in terms of dealing with the medieval bureaucracy of a university. But again, thank you, George, for the things you've done. Jack, thank you for really pulling together a really excellent department in terms of and also my other friend and colleague, Claire McInerney, the acting dean of the school, who was the glue that held it together in the last couple of years. So I really appreciate this. I am not going to, as I said, get too deeply into the paper. There are copies of it that are available for you. If you don't have it, give me your email address and I'll shoot a copy to you. What I really want to do today is to talk a little bit about the importance of continuing education and lifelong learning for journalists. I think when we're talking about quality of news, it becomes so much more important to revisit the whole idea of continuing ed and what is happening. It's if we look only at the downside, if we look only at the newsrooms that are half empty, the buildings that are being sold, it's the churches becoming restaurants kind of approach to civilization. What we really need to do is to step back and look at our continuing education and say, how does it fit? How does it become the third leg on the stool of quality journalism? And what I would like to do is hit a few of the points of the paper in terms of the main suggestion being that we're at a point where we need almost a national coalition, a national commission to take a look at the whole question of continuing education. I was also thinking of Yogi Berra's comment that we are lost, but we're making good time. And then his other suggestion that if you come to a fork in the road, take it. So I may not be an expert on some of this stuff, but I'll try. I've had the privilege of doing assessments of continuing education programs for Knight Foundation, George Marshall Fund, German Marshall Fund, I'm sorry, for the U.S. State Department for a number of programs that we did overseas and in the United States. And what strikes me in reviewing that material is the idea that it has to keep pace with the change, and the change is greater than it's ever been, as you know. And I think that if we step back and look at a national coalition that could be pulled together to examine this, I'm talking about the universities and colleges and the schools, the high schools that are teaching journalism. I think we need an overarching view of what is happening. We have to document our successes and our failures a little bit more carefully than we've done. We spend a lot of money, but not enough. We spent $3 trillion for Afghanistan, and I think we can save a little bit of that money for some of the continuing education things that we're talking about. There's a need, for instance, everybody's doing good work, but they're scattered all over the country. And in the paper, I list a number of the programs that are worth taking a look at. But I think what we really need in this national coalition is some kind of a depository, a place where we can take our experiences, our teaching materials, the things that we've done, and bring them together and say, okay, this works and this doesn't work. We heard some really excellent presentations this morning in terms of a careful, precise look at how the media function. And I would like to see some of the same discipline applied to things like the Neiman program at Harvard, where I had the good fortune of being an alumnus of. The programs at Columbia, the programs at the University of Michigan and Stanford. I think that there's what we have in the equation that we didn't have 10 or 15 years ago is a robust online internet service. And I think we have to start looking at the possibilities of this, not so much in terms of what it is killing, but what it is clearing the field to grow from. I'm hoping that whatever this model of a national commission is, would create a set of global linkages, because there's really very good training going on in Europe, where I've spent a lot of time, in Latin America, where I've spent last time, and a little bit in Africa. But I think that we need some kind of a mechanism for pulling all of this together. The other thing that I'd like to leave you with is the idea that it's no secret that it's becoming tremendously expensive, if not a burden that can't be carried too much longer on the part of students who cannot afford the 4 years for the BA, the 5 or 6 years for the master's, the 7 years for the doctorate. We can hold those models, but I think as we as universities are looking at the whole process, we have to step back and say, wait a minute, we've got new tools. Why do we have to have 4 years? Why can't we have 3 years and then create a number of tickets that an individual can then come forward with and say, okay, look, what is happening in the field 2 or 3 years from now? What is happening 5 years from now? If I were trying to teach ethics, journalism ethics today, from the old lecture notes of 10 or 15 years ago, they obviously wouldn't work. And what we've had in the way of privacy issues coming up in social networking, the hacking questions of what happens in terms of national security and where does safety and national defense come into play. What I'm saying is that there are a whole bunch of issues involving ethics and responsibility that didn't exist. One thing I would like to suggest is to try a couple of pilot programs. One pilot program is all of these wonderful, talented journalists who have built up careers on a lifetime of standards and practice, who suddenly are downsized, disappeared, whatever the term is that we want to use. And on the other hand, we have a young group of robust young people who are going into journalism, who have a nuance and a sense of the quality of what can be done with social networking, what can be done with data mining, what can be done with a whole bunch of things. I would like to see these two groups come together in continuing ed programs where we have the senior quality journalists working with the undergraduates and in a bartering situation where they could, in fact, the young people could bring to the table this whole mystery of online and share it with journalists who could bring to it their ability to act with ethical responsibility, who could show you how to construct a story. I know that there's going to be some discussion about the lack of editing that takes place, the idea that we're all our self-editors. These are the kinds of things that basically could happen. The other thing that I'd like to think about is a pilot program that deals with the potholes in the information highway. The idea that there's, we're hearing it today, that county news, state news, local news is just not happening the way it was covered in the past. What I would like to suggest is that we take citizen journalism, which is a large, vague term, it's not vague in the sense of what it is, but vague in what it could be, and start training citizen journalists to, in fact, be a cadre of coverage for the local town council, for the county beat that is not being covered, for whatever it happens to be. I mean, give the citizen journalism robustness, a life that it deserves, and not simply say do citizen journalism. Here's a team I'm living down in Virginia now in a county that has 33,000 people. The nearest town, which is the largest and only town in the county, has 12,000 people. Yet we have a very sophisticated library that has quality computer hardware, has meeting rooms, has reaching out that could, in fact, be focused in a citizen journalism way. So I'm not shy about it. I would like to see the beginnings of this consortium here at Rutgers. I would like to see it at other places as well. I would like to see the networking taking place. The other idea, Dick Hefner, who was a professor here in the school, was a beloved professor for years. I was on his show, The Open Mind, and I suggested to him that we create something called during the Depression, we had the CCCs, the Civil Conservation Corps. Why not create something called the Communication Conservation Corps? Bring these really talented people together who could work with us. What we really need is sort of a linkage kind of approach to this. I want to close with the words of Portlandia. If you've been on the IFC channel and you've seen Portlandia, we can take some wisdom from what they're saying. In one case, they had a journalist who was being fired, and he said, basically, I'm a journalist. I don't want to be a linkalist. I don't want to be a collator, a curator, an aggregator. We're at a point where we're aggregating so much and not putting the water back in the dam, behind the dam, that we're becoming a California reservoir in terms of quality of water. What I would like to see this experiment do is to really take the citizen journalists, take the young people who are really anxious to become better journalists, take the seasoned journalists who feel totally morale broken in many ways and yet have so much to give. Bring them all together, and then I think we'll be able to follow the fork in the road. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Sean Herbert, who's a producer at CBS News, and Sean also received his BA in Political Science and Journalism at Rutgers, and he's going to be presenting on journalists versus content providers, how to balance news gathering in the digital age. And Sean and I are co-collaborating. Not really, I'm just clicking. Okay.
Anyway, thank you very much. The first thing I'd like to do is, again, also extend my thank yous to Professor Almonte, to my alma mater, everyone here, to Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation for helping me make it possible, my co-panelists, Professor Goodman, Professor Aumente, Professor Keith. Journalists versus content providers. If you go to the first slate, I'm not sure where that came from. How exciting. That is not, no.
That's a surprise.
It's okay. Can you back up? We're just on the wrong slideshow. This is one of I also am a adjunct professor at SUNY Purchase, and I think this was when I was a guest lecturer somewhere. Can you close this out completely?
Yeah, of course.
And just go back to, do I need to give you my thumb drive again?
Yeah.
I do? Oh, we have a pause. So sorry, hold on a moment.
A mini break.
A mini break. Always good to back up your material. Sorry, everybody.
Sorry, everyone.
No worries. It was in a file called RU. So I can't remember now. RU Digital, I think. Take a second. Let you get it. So, yeah, thumb drive. RU Digital, there's a whole, nope. Right now I'm confused.
That's I did this one.
Yeah, it's not in here. Hold on.
Yeah, this is the one I did.
That's crazy. All right. I'm going to wing it. I'm not sure how that happens, but I had a matching thumb drive, I guess. So I gave you the wrong one. So forget the slides, and eventually we'll get to a couple of video clips. So the question I pose for everybody today is what makes a journalist a journalist? To help answer this question, I'd like to borrow the words of Don Hewitt that I picked up during my years working at 60 Minutes. And that is, the best way to tackle an issue is to tell you a story. So here's mine. I grew up a news junkie. I was glued to TV whenever there was breaking news. I remember vividly Nixon's resignation, John Lennon's assassination, President Ronald Reagan's being shot. As a freshman at Rutgers University, I remember watching from a campus student TV at the student center, Dan Rather's report of the Challenger disaster. It feels like yesterday. Of course, it's not.
Some of the debris from what is thought to be the exploded space shuttle was coming down. Understand the picture as best we can make it out. The launch, the delayed launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger went off this morning, and for a minute and 12 seconds, everything...
Appropriately sober, just the facts as they were known. High trustworthiness. I wanted to be a journalist. I was idealistic. I believed there was no democracy without journalism. I believed in the value of the Fourth Estate. I took courses that provided a foundation, like media law, news reporting and writing. They all prepared me for this craft that I've journeyed on for 25 plus years. Professor Cohen was a guiding force. Most memorable was Professor Bildner's Media and Ethics course, the required text aptly titled Groping for Ethics. I was taught the value of attribution and the importance of corroboration. I was convinced that fighting for justice was a noble cause. But I learned here that it is most noble to be truthful. After I acquired this foundation, I watched the news in a different light. Is it right? Is it fair? Is it honest? That was the criteria moving forward for me, the way I would gauge whether or not it was credible and quality journalism. I was empowered by the notion that the role of the journalist was to separate fact from fiction, policy from political posturing. I idolized the founding fathers of journalism. They happened to be fathers, Edward R. Murrow and Fred Friendly. I still brag about sharing Murrow's birthday. It's true. And Friendly, a phrase that has always stuck with me for the importance of accuracy, the essential definition of quality. He said, if you are the first, no one will ever remember. If you are wrong, no one will ever forget. I was thirsty for more knowledge. After graduating from Rutgers, I attended Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. You can play that clip if you like. It was this clip. I was at Medill when this happened.
Something is happening outside. Peter Arnett, join me here. Let's describe to our viewers what we're seeing. The skies over Baghdad have been illuminated. We're seeing bright flashes going off all over the sky. Peter?
Well, there's anti-aircraft gunfire going.
We can go on, but this was that moment when CNN in August 1990 proved that 24/7 cable news was here to stay, broadcasting live from Baghdad as the first Gulf War got underway, and their first major exclusive. After Medill, my first years at CBS News coincided with the proliferation of cable news outlets and the birth of the Internet. That was the paradigm shift. The core values of journalism, my core values as a journalist, are not commonplace on pundit-driven cable talk shows, nor the Internet. The anchor of the CBS News, my colleague Scott Pelley, recently stated that the core values of journalism need to become the ruling principles of what we're reading on the Internet. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be pervasive. But I think we're at an inflection point here in journalism and in media now where we're making a decision about the quality of our country going forward because of the quality of the information that we're offering our audience. It worries him, this is Pelley speaking, a great deal. He says he's often on the bandwagon banging the drum, particularly with young people who are interested in journalism because we need them, but we need them to be good. I couldn't agree more. We now live in an age where never before has so much information been available to so many around the globe. But as Pelley reminds me, it's also true that never in human history has more bad information been available to more people. And that's the point. That's certainly why I'm here today. I hope that's why you're all here today. Scott Pelley describes Twitter and Facebook not as journalism, but as gossip. And that journalism was invented as an anecdote to gossip. That's what I learned here. Anything that is not verified is speculation. It's rumor. It's uncorroborated. Not only that, but we can't continue to allow the lines to become so blurred that our citizens confuse entertainment with news, scripted shtick with journalism. What guests say on The Daily Show is valuable, but is it news? Or should it always be considered entertainment? When President Barack Obama decided to appear on Between Two Ferns as part of his rollout of his affordable health care plan, was that really news? Or was that nothing more than scripted propaganda? Or is it both? Conversely, should journalists appear on entertainment shows? Or does it further blur the line? Again, my colleague Scott Pelley believes it is not appropriate for journalists to appear on entertainment programming. There's too much at risk for the audience to think, wait a minute, is this scripted? Is it not? Are you telling me the truth? Is it acting? That's great advice to any young journalist. But let me be clear, the controversy surrounding now suspended NBC News anchor Brian Williams is not the opportunity for others to gloat or take advantage. Harm to the reputation of any journalist hurts all journalists. However, with the scathing Columbia J School postmortem on the Rolling Stone UVA expose earlier this week, might journalism be suffering a crisis of faith? If so, I don't believe this is the time for J schools and journalism departments to be abandoning courses that provide students with solid ethical foundations. I would argue that these class lessons are more important and more valuable than ever. I don't know who watches HBO, but where else will journalists of tomorrow learn to question the integrity of the interview John Oliver conducted with Eric Snowden for his HBO show? Was it scripted? Did Oliver provide his questions in advance to Snowden? During the editing process, did they marry a question about one topic with the answer of another? I don't know. Unless we do know, how much of that should be valued as news? Snowden's clearly a newsmaker, right? But, and I apologize, I had a picture of that interview, a screen grab, and Snowden and Oliver both have papers in their hands. I've conducted 1,000 interviews. I've never seen the person I'm interviewing holding a piece of paper. And I don't know the answer. I don't know if it was prepared comments. I know nothing about the quality of that interview that John Oliver did. Another example of who will teach the journalists of tomorrow about the pitfalls of staging, that the simple request to film an establishing shot of a subject at their desk or in their office or walking along a nearby street is a form of staging. And although a broadcast news staple that I have requested many, many times of people that I'm interviewing or producing a segment about at CBS News and other jobs that I've had, we need to be careful. I'm seeing staging more often everywhere, including sports journalism, where I think it's particularly abusive. Is a hero shot of an athlete dripping in sweat a real moment when it happens in the confines of an interview? Or is it more often a stage moment? I was once asked to film an athlete from St. Louis under its iconic Gateway Arch, even though I knew, after speaking to the athlete, he had never been there before. When I refused, someone else was flown in to shoot it. How will the journalists of tomorrow learn to appreciate that the use of music in any segment can falsely create suspense or unfairly manipulate emotions? This is another device outlawed by most news organizations. And I can tell you personally, I've never once used music unless I was doing a profile on a musician or some body of work that involved music while employed at CBS News. But again, in the sports realm, I was required to have music in all of my segments at one of the sports segments in every single production I had. So every piece I did, I was required to score it, to include music, and I was told when to use strings, when to manipulate an emotional moment. And I will tell you that I would get into arguments all the time about how I thought the authentic, natural, real moment of what that person was saying was so much more powerful without being distracted by a piece of work that I chose as an amateur that I thought as music could actually help and not distract. And certainly I wasn't looking to enhance. So eventually that relationship ended. But who will the journalists of tomorrow be that recognize and learn to avoid potential conflicts of interest in the corporate landscape that so many media outlets now exist in today? I once pitched a project about alcohol consumption at major sporting venues, only be told by corporate lawyers that they were unwilling to jeopardize their billion-dollar TV contract with a sports league just so I could do a segment on alcohol abuse at sports stadiums. In conclusion, in this digital age, anyone with a cell phone or a camera can be a content provider. But with great power comes great responsibility. I'm here today to say we must strive for better for our journalists of tomorrow. We must protect the role of the journalist. And most importantly, we as mentors must ensure that the next generation is provided the tools and the wisdom to defend journalistic integrity, just as Professor Roger Cohen and Professor Elise Bildner provided them to me here at Rutgers University so many years ago. I look forward to your questions, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, and thank you for going with the flow, despite the technical difficulties. Our final speaker is Dr. Susan Keith, who's an associate professor at Rutgers University in the Department of Journalism and Media Studies. She's worked as a newspaper editor and reporter. She was also, as a doctoral student, I had to mention this, named outstanding faculty by the Doctoral Student Association. So thank you, Susan, and I'll get your...
Oh, okay. Okay, good deal. Thanks so much. So today I'm going to talk about one of those components of quality journalism that we ideally never see, or that we notice only in its absence, and that's quality editing. Veteran editors like to say that at its best, their craft is invisible, ensuring that facts are correct and that the writer looks good. But one of a host of difficult outcomes of traditional journalism's recent declines, starting with that perfect storm in 2008 of declining audiences and the financial collapse that sharply reduced advertising revenues, has been a reduction in the number of editors employed across all media platforms. You've probably noticed this yourself if you read books or if you read magazines or if you look at websites. Now, to understand what we mean when we're talking about declines in editing, we need to think about the different types of editors that exist. So certainly when we say the word editor or we refer to editing, we can be talking about an administrative level task that involves someone who's setting the tone for a news media outlet or doing hiring and firing and maybe looking at only a very small minority of actual reports. We can also be thinking about editor as sort of a day-to-day manager and coach, a mid-level person who might support the gathering of information and the creation of content by supporting writers and reporters. So we might think of this person as a section editor in a magazine or newspaper or for a website. But then we also have sort of that last set of eyes level of editing. People who are conducting the final review of completed stories for errors of fact, spelling, style, and potential violations of legal and ethical standards. And so if we thought about that, we might think about copy editors, or in the extreme tiny number of magazines that still have them, fact checkers. Since this panel is in part about journalism education, I want to focus on this last group of people, this lowest level frontline group of editors. And I want to do that for a couple of reasons. First, these are the positions that often are the last filter to catch the errors that are made by the journalists that we as journalism professors send out into the world. New journalists are going to inevitably make mistakes, and you hope that there are these frontline editors available to catch those mistakes. And these jobs were also the jobs that students who found themselves to be talented at editing could get as entry-level jobs. But these jobs are disappearing, and along with that, a layer of support for quality journalism. When I began teaching journalism full-time about 14 years ago after a 16-year career in newspapers, students who took my editing classes and did well and didn't mind working anonymously could usually find an editing job more readily than my students who wanted to be reporters and needed to see their byline. There were so few students who were willing to take a more anonymous position, who were willing, at least in newspapers, to work nights and weekends, and who had the orientation toward detail and a love for and knowledge of language, that it was pretty easy for them to find jobs. In fact, I remember the day that one of my students, who was fully bilingual English-Spanish, came back to me and told me that the newspaper he'd interned for had given him a job on the copy desk, and he was going to be making almost what I was making as a tenure-track assistant professor. Most of these students wound up at newspapers because newspapers were the people that were employing large cadres of frontline editors. Pretty much every newspaper around the turn of the century, over 25,000 in the United States, had a copy desk, and there were about 1,400 of those daily newspapers then. And my research found that they were, even at the 25,000 level, employing about 4 copy editors. Then at large metro newspapers, you often had multiple copy desks, and I found that it was particularly easy to place students who were good and who were interested in sports, because so many journalists interested in sports wanted the byline, wanted to be part of the story. They didn't want to be sitting in an office behind the scenes. Of course, things have changed quite a bit. And one way they have changed is that the number of editing positions has declined dramatically at U.S. daily newspapers. These are figures from the American Society of Newspaper Editors, and there is a problem with these figures, as I'm sure Steve Lacey knows well. ASNE has not been consistent in the years that it has done research about how many people are employed at daily newspapers with the way it's divided journalists by job category. So in 2006, they were putting copy and layout editors, people who do design, which had, those two jobs had diverged in the late 1980s and 1990s as we got more specialization in newsrooms and as desktop publishing software became prevalent. By 2014, those people who are doing design have been pulled out and lumped with online producers. So we're not exactly comparing apples to apples here, but you can see that there is some reduction. And I can tell you from the newsrooms I worked in, there were always fewer designers than editors. So that group that has gone away would not have accounted for 6,000 people. In some places, these frontline editors that have been eliminated just means that some material is going out, particularly to go up on the web, with little to no editing or self-editing, right? So you write your story, you read your story, and you upload your story. At some news outlets, and the Denver Post is one that's indicative of this, mid-level section editors, assistant city editors, sports editors, assistant sports editors, have taken on an extra task. So they've been asked to do the detail-oriented editing as well as the big picture editing. And in one thing that has really changed the face of editing since about 2009, 2010, is that sometimes editing is being farmed out to centralized copy and design desks that serve quite a number of media outlets. Now, this is a movement that came to us from Europe, and if you want to think about why we have it, you can blame the weather in Dublin. Some newspaper managers in Dublin realized that it would be a lot nicer to live in the south of France. So they set up an operation in the south of France in a small town where they got great tax advantages, and they imported a lot of native English-speaking editors and designers there, set them down at a fleet of Macs, and they started editing all of the pages that were produced for advanced sections, feature sections, weekend review sections, travel sections for newspapers in Ireland. This caught on pretty heavily in the Anglophone world. It's very common in Australia. Lots of Australian newspapers have part of their pages produced in New Zealand. And because copy editors in the former British Empire are called sub-editors, these things came to be known as sub-hubs. So in 2010, I gave a talk to the American Copy Editors Society, and I said, guys, this is going to come. And I got a lot of pushback, but it's now here. So Gannett has sub-hubs. Advanced Publications has sub-hubs. Gatehouse has sub-hubs. And just 2 weeks ago, I was at the American Copy Editors Society, and I was talking to one of the head of the Gatehouse sub-hub, which is in Austin, Texas. And he said, we're about to make an announcement that we're going to be editing not only the pages of newspapers owned by our company, but we're about to pull in a big client that is an external client. So you'll be having your stories edited by someone who is truly a third-party contractor. Now, there's been some pushback and some concern against this idea of remote editing, because a lot of people think that you can't really edit for a community very well if you don't know that community, or, for example, how to spell Louisiana. So this is from the Times of Acadiana, a Gannett newspaper in Lafayette, Louisiana, and there's the headline on the front cover, which was designed at a Gannett editing hub in Des Moines, Iowa. Wildly embarrassing. And in fact, there's been so much pushback that when the Daily Press of Newport News, Virginia wanted to hire an editor recently, they pointed out, come and work for us. You can work in the community that you are editing for on the newspaper that you might read. Don't get stuck in a hub. Come work with us and be just a journalist. So I wanted to know a little bit more about what these changes might mean for us in journalism education. Editing has been a pretty key component of the journalism course process or the journalism curriculum for many, many years, and most schools, even very small ones that maybe teach journalism within English, often have an editing course. But I had a sense that we might not be preparing students for this 21st century world in the best way we could after I organized a pre-conference on the future of editing in 2009 for the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. And I had some senior editors come, I had some copy editors come, I had people who were lead editors at hyperlocals come. And sort of just as an afterthought, I found some journalism students who were Dow Jones News Fund editing interns out at newspapers outside Boston. And I had them come and talk about what they had learned in the classroom and how it applied to their everyday life. And they generally thought that they'd been prepared well for the internships they were doing, with one exception. One of the students, a young woman, raised her hand and said, you know, and I should tell you that she was a student at a mega journalism, standalone journalism school in the Midwest, one that we would all recognize. And she said, I don't understand why in my editing course they made me count headlines. Now, do any of you know what I mean when I say count headlines? Okay, good. In the pre-computer era, the way that you estimated whether your headline was going to fit on a story before it was typeset was by writing it out on a piece of paper, and then you would count 3 counts for a capital W, 2 counts for any other letter. And there were charts that you would have on the wall of the newsroom that would tell you how many counts would fit in what amount of space. Now, in my very first job in journalism in 1982, we used that. But it was only because the family that I was working for was super cheap and hadn't invested in sort of the previous generation even of technology. So nobody's doing this. Nobody's done this in 25, 30 years by the time this woman's telling me this. But she'd spent time in editing instruction doing that. So I decided I had to know what other people who teach editing as I do were doing in their classes. Now, unfortunately, there's no list of everyone who teaches editing. There's no big group of editing professors. So I wound up going through all of the universities that teach journalism in either accredited or unaccredited programs, looking at their course offerings for 5 semesters to see if they'd offered editing. And then I had a grad student call all of them and say, do you teach editing? So many interesting definitions of what it means to teach editing, and did I mean nonlinear video editing, or did I mean something that involved print and online news? I found 399 of these professors. Sometimes this was more than one professor at a big school, but I wanted to know if different people were teaching different things within the same school. I got about a 53% return rate. I had some people who told me, who returned the survey, but said, hey, I don't teach editing, or I haven't taught it I wanted them to have taught it in the last 5 years. So I asked them about the sort of traditional editing skills, the things that I started my career teaching, because these were relevant when I was working as a PTL or adjunct instructor back in the 80s. And almost all of them were teaching grammar, word editing, newspaper headline writing, and fact-checking. Now, you'll notice that we drop down as we begin to get more into tasks that are more difficult. But almost everybody is doing newspaper headline writing. Notice not too many of them are doing newspaper headline counting, but it's still nearly a third for a skill that has not been done in a newsroom in 25 years. So then I asked them about what specific things they were doing in word editing. And as you can see, most of them were doing all of the things that we would think about editors having to do in their jobs. Interestingly, you'll notice that cutting story length was not as popular as I think it might once have been. And I wondered if that had to do with the internet, because now we don't always have to cut stories. And that can be a bad thing. I also asked them about design skills, because at some schools, including Rutgers, the editing course is where you learn about design. And so I asked them about what types of things they were learning to design. Fewer people teaching design, but notice the type of design that's most often being taught is newspaper design. At some schools, that's really necessary because you have a student newspaper that is still printed and maybe you've got to teach the skills for that student newspaper. But I found that very interesting. Then, of course, I thought, well, let me ask them about digital, 21st century skills. And I think you'll find this interesting. Lots of people, about 2/3, were teaching their students how to write headlines for the web. Less than half were teaching how to write blurbs, the little thing you often see under a web headline that tells you more about the story. Only about 1/3 were teaching how to insert search terms or keywords that could improve your search engine optimization. Only about 1/4 were teaching how to write cut lines for online photo galleries. And if you went down to other things like creating online maps, designing online slideshows, the sort of things that we know are clickbait, we're getting like below 10% here. So then I thought, well, maybe they're spending all their time on social media. Well, not exactly. A lot of people have likened Twitter to being sort of the 21st century headline. It's the thing that we often can use to convey breaking news, or that we can use to publicize journalism, longer journalism that we've done. But as you see, only around 1/3 of editing teachers were teaching that. And it's probably worth noting that I ask these professors, what did you teach the last time you finished teaching a course? So not the class you're in right now, not the class you're going to teach, the last one you closed the books on. Now, why is this? Maybe because of age. More than half of my respondents reported that they were 55 or older. But it may, this is my last slide, it may have also had something to do with the fact that they're having to do so many other things. I asked these professors to tell me if there was something they wished they could have taught, what was it, and why didn't they teach it? Over and over again, I heard students don't have basic grammar skills. So takeaways, I think that we need to teach students to edit for multiple platforms, including mobile media. We need to incentivize these older professors to use new things. And we need to think about where we're going to do our remedial grammar instruction. Thank you.
Okay, we're already almost over time, so I think we'll just take 10 minutes. And yeah, if anyone has a question, I'll go ahead and open it up. And if our panelists can come on down and make sure you push the button for the microphone.
Excuse me.
Great stuff.
I like the slide so much, I'm going to leave it.
Hi, my name is Yogi. I'm an undergrad here at Rutgers. I have two questions, actually. The first one goes out to Professor Goodman. Especially with, I guess, the state of Indiana passing the bill issuing, like, companies like Hobby Lobby the right to, I guess, against gay rights, basically. So with this whole concept of democratic competence, what is the actual criteria that the state or the Supreme Court uses to, like, appropriate which institutions or corporations can be counted as individuals?
Answer that in 30 seconds.
Democratic competence is not a term that the Supreme Court uses, and in fact, the Supreme Court is not very interested, is much less interested in output than in the first idea of democratic legitimization of free speech. Who counts as an individual? Are you trying to get at our corporations individuals? Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are.
Oh.
They count as individuals. Corporations, not for all purposes, but certainly for freedom of speech purposes.
Okay. And my second question is for Mr. Herbert.
Yes.
I'm in no way defending people like Mr. Oliver or Mr. Stewart, but being that they are comedians who don't identify themselves as journalists, I guess their goal for their shows is different. So is the work that they're doing to raise awareness for certain issues in any way reduce their legitimacy for their message by the medium that they use?
I certainly hope so. My criticism isn't actually of those conducting the interviews or the gets that they land for their studio shows. the blurred line reference is actually to the audience who now is taking that because it feels like it could be the equivalent of what they're watching on the evening news or reading online at a major newspaper, that interview was conducted the same way as a seasoned reporter or any journalist who is bound by certain news standards to conduct that interview. So I absolutely think they're here to stay, and they're doing brilliant jobs. I think John Oliver conducted a very compelling interview, full of profanity and lots of other things that are atypical even in the environment in the world that we live in today. But the question I have to ask, I'll say one more, it's a great anecdote. When I was here, I was taught, if your mother tells you she loves you, get a second source, right? So how do I know if John Oliver conducted that interview? Because it really felt very rehearsed. He whips out an iPad, Snowden responds to it. There was just a lot of it that felt style over substance. And I don't know the answer, but I think the issue is our audiences are being confused by that type of reporting, that type of interviewing.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Emily Gibbs. I'm an undergraduate here studying journalism and media studies. And I guess it's towards the same thing, Mr. Herbert. My question is, you said that journalists should not appear on entertainment TV, correct?
I attributed that actually to Scott Pelley, but I do believe it.
But the thing that I guess confuses me is that these different entertainment political platforms are so prevalent today. I'm taking a course on news, entertainment, and politics that I almost feel that journalists should be going on these shows to clarify everything, because people are just going to keep watching these shows, and if we're just going to stand back and not try to intervene as journalists, I don't think that's the right approach. So do you believe that it would be how could journalists help make us more truthful and a platform that we should be utilizing?
Well, let me first say, ironically, most of you probably think I spent my entire life working in broadcast. I actually focused strictly on print as an undergraduate and even at graduate school, because I thought the importance and the focus should be on the writing, on the grammar, on the editing, because it would make me more intelligent when I then had to write a script that had to be much more concise and convey a story in far fewer words. Having said that, I do think that the celebrity aspect of being approached and asked to appear on David Letterman or any host of any entertainment shows are for whatever reason, predominantly people who are on camera. And I don't know that we should be having our journalists as celebrities too. But it's certainly outside of Charlie Rose, PBS, some of the publicly funded journalistic outlets that you'll find the very best reporters that are obscure to most Americans and most of the world's readers and purveyors of content. So I think that's why I'm concerned by it. That's why I agree with Scott Pelley's concern with it. And I think that, again, for me, my slogan today is blurred lines. I think it adds to the blurred lines.
I think we'll just have two more questions. There's one down here and one up there.
You guys have two of you, right?
Yeah. Is everyone? Yeah.
Hi, Gina Marcello, alum of Skills, undergraduate, master's degree, and PhD, and assistant professor at Georgian Court University in Lakewood. My question is this. What makes a journalist a journalist? You started with that question, so I wanted to follow up. What really does make a journalist today a journalist, in your opinion? And it goes to all members of the panel. Thank you.
I'm not even a journalist.
Well, I guess I just felt like I just answered two questions in a row, so I didn't want to go first. But
Jerry, go ahead.
Okay. I think a journalist has to really have a set of standards and practices that it's almost like a coral reef that builds up over time. It was interesting when I was doing the book on New Jersey newspapers for the 150th anniversary. I started out writing a book about the history of the papers, but the interviews were happening in 2004, 2005, 2006, just before the whole asteroid slammed into the mass media. But I still think that that incremental buildup, that quality of fairness, balance, getting all sides. I mean, it almost sounds like a cliche, but it really is important to keep repeating it. These various levels of of competence that we expect of a journalist. I think also that a journalist, he or she, has to have a fire in the belly kind of thing, that they really believe that there's something out there that has to be, the curtain has to be torn back. I've done a lot of training of journalists overseas, and a lot who have come out of the Soviet system. I mean, the issue of licensing, for instance, what constitutes a good or bad journalist? In Europe, that issue becomes not only what is a good or bad journalist, but how do we designate through licensing who is going to be a journalist? And of course, if it's Putin doing the designating, we're in trouble. So I think that there's this whole organic, content in terms of what is happening. And what I was saying before is that this whole thing has to be opened up in light of the new technologies. One of my favorite little current hatreds is native advertising. The idea that you turn over your store to the people who are selling you something. The idea that they write a story that looks like a story that isn't a story, that has a fig leaf somewhere in there saying this is not a story by a journalist, this is a story by, think of your favorite corporation to hate, and think of that corporation being given carte blanche. So I think that I would like to see the definition of a journalist loosened. I mean, I think that the citizen journalism situation has really opened up the idea that anybody can be a journalist. I think we set the standards, we aspire to be a profession, but we don't say you are and you are not, because somebody else is going to say you are and you are not, and that may turn out to be a regime that you don't want to be in bed with.
Okay.
Hi, Simon, Rutgers alum again. Professor Babbitt's class was awesome. So my question revolves around the idea of what a journalist is. Putting aside things like licensing, native advertising, things like the White House Correspondents' Dinner, isn't a journalism, this is to all the members of the panel, isn't a journalist inherently an activist? Isn't it someone who has a point to make and a point to prove? The idea that there's such a thing as objectivity, I mean, when you have a 4-star general talking about the Iraq War, and that's your only person you're interviewing, how can you put that off as objective, but say that an athlete in front of the St. Louis Arch isn't? That's just an example. I don't mean to. It's a question that goes to all the members of the panel, and in terms of the legal aspect of that, where do you believe that line might be drawn in case law in the future, in activism, in journalism?
Well, and this also is a little responsive to the earlier question. I mean, my own view is that we're not going to succeed in coming up, nobody's going to succeed in cabining this term or defining this term, journalism for all purposes, that you can be a journalist for some purposes, and I think John Oliver is, in the sense if journalism is defined as, what did you say, unveiling the curtain on things that are important. I mean, he has done that in spades on so many issues so effectively. Now, he may not be a journalist with respect to certain journalistic practices and interviews, and then it sort of creates much more pressure on the consumer side to understand exactly what it is that you're getting when. On objectivity, I mean, that is one of the criteria in the canon of sort of journalistic practice that really never had much sway in the law, much less sway than things like fact-checking and editing and sort of independence, not from your own beliefs, but from corporate and advertisers and management.
And it's probably also important to remember that objectivity is kind of a 20th century American construct. The press in England and France has been partisan and has survived. Democracies have survived there without objectivity as we think of it. And certainly our early colonial press was not objective. So something to keep in mind.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Lunch is outside, and we'll see you at